As you can see, this meeting is now under new management. Mary Woods has gone off to catch a plane. I'm Frances Cairncross. I'm the rector of Exeter College. I've been a journalist all my life, so I'm really a hack. Mary mentioned at the beginning of her introduction that this was World Philosophy Day. I was more struck by the fact that this is the year which is the 250th anniversary of the first publication of Adam Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments. This session, you can see, is called The Political Economy of Change. Political economy was also an Adam Smith phrase, a man who felt that economics and philosophy were two issues bound as one and transmuted through politics. Earlier this year, I was at a dinner in Edinburgh hosted by Alex Salmond to celebrate this 250th anniversary. And among the guests at the dinner, there were also two other winners of the Nobel Prize for Economics, not Professor Sen, but two others. Of those three people, of the politician, of Alex Salmond, and the two economists, which was the one, do you think, who had read, the only one who had read the Theory of Moral Sentiments? Anybody want to guess? Alex Salmond, yes. And I think that this session should be the session of the politics of Amartya Sen's thoughts, because politicians are the people whose job it is to translate philosophy and economics into the art of the possible. We've already heard from one politician who has eloquently described a manifesto for how this might be done. We're now in a moment about to hear from another politician. I'm rather worried, I have to say, that about the number of young Labour politicians, I think of Liam Byrne and of David Miliband, who use Sen's phraseology, who talk about capability and talk about equal in what respect, I mean, equality of what. I don't know whether this is also true of the Conservative Party, but Peter Lilley has been a practitioner of economics in the real world for a very long time. He began his political career as PPS to Nigel Lawson. He had 10 years in ministerial office. That included 5 years in that most difficult of jobs for a minister in those days as Secretary of State for Social Security. He chaired the Globalization and Global Poverty Policy Group, and he is also now co-chair of the Trade Out of Poverty campaign. So he brings to these issues an enormous wealth of practical experience of creating a strategy. Marcel Fafchamps, on my left, has been in Oxford's Department of Economics for the past 10 years, but he is not a mere theoretician, because he spent the formative years of his career in Africa, predominantly working on issues of rural development, and later in India. So he knows a great deal about what happens on the ground, where economics meets humanity struggling to make a living. And Alison Evans, on my far left, is the new director of the Overseas Development Institute, a body that has worked very hard to bring together economics and politics in the past, the length of its career. She is an economist by training, but she has been preoccupied throughout her career by pragmatic issues dealing with poverty and with public policy. So I hope that what we're going to have in the last hour of this session is the emergence of a series of issues, of ways in which we can bring together politics, philosophy, and economics, this familiar Oxford trio. And I'm going to start with Peter Lilley.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a great privilege to be invited to take part in this, particularly as I'm obviously the token Tory. When I phoned up Sabina to find out what my role was, she, with exquisite courtesy, said words to the effect that I'm the grit in the oyster. I do recall, actually, as a minister, one thing I discovered on analysing the failures of my predecessors, that where there had been real blunders, it was where a policy had been developed by people who were all true believers in that policy. I therefore made it a practice in my department that if ever I had a policy build committee, I had on it someone who disagreed with the policy to make sure that we knew some of the problems and obstacles we might encounter. And I think I'm here today as a sort of devil's advocate. So to the extent that I say negative things, please only blame me for that and not my co-chairs of Trade Out of Poverty, who undoubtedly would disagree with me, since they, on that issue, though we agree entirely on the role of Trade Out of Poverty in the campaign, the importance of it, because they're Claire Short, former International Development Secretary, John Battle, a former Labour Minister for both Trade and Foreign Affairs, Ming Campbell, Lord Hastings and myself. So I exempt them. Please don't blame them for anything I say. I just have one concern about one aspect of the discussion so far, and that is that it reminds me of a story which prevailed in the Treasury when I was a Treasury Minister. Treasury, as you know, is full of extremely brilliant officials who love to have a sound theoretical basis for any policy. And the story goes that a minister came in, Yes Minister style, and announced that he wanted to introduce a policy initiative, and they came out with their normal objection, but Minister, it won't work in practice. He said, but it does work in practice in the Netherlands and varieties of it in local government in Halifax. And they were a bit taken back by this, but then they replied, that may be so, Minister, but will it work in theory? And there's a slight touch of that about some of our discussion today, and I have worries about theory. First of all, because I am, like James Pannell, a practicing politician, and I want practical answers, as he does, and I have to say, at risk of embarrassing him, I do agree with about 85% of his manifesto, if not more. I want practical answers when I'm thinking about development to real-world questions. How can aid be made more effective? Is there an optimum level of aid in any country? Does the amount of aid, the effect of aid, decline with increasing amounts, or does it have rising returns? Should we be reducing, as we have been over the last 15 years, the amount of aid going on infrastructure and agricultural development, and increasing the amount going on health and education, as has been happening? And if so, how can we explain that a lot of that hasn't been getting through to the poorest people, but often to the better off people in the societies we're trying to help? So there's practical questions I want answers to. The second worry I always have about too much of an abstract approach in development economics is that development already is the last remaining playground on which ideologues of both left and right can play. They can have more influence in development policy than they can anywhere else, because it's the one area where policy is little influenced by the voters at home and often little influenced by the voters in the countries to which the policy is being applied. So you have left-wingers, often in the NGOs, who see it as an opportunity to revive socialism in some developing country, even where their own electors at home have abandoned that. Or at least they can thwart capitalism in developing countries. And on the right, often in the international organizations, the World Bank, IMF, and so on, you see some pure ideological right-wingers. I used to think I was until I met some of these, who believe that they can experiment in developing countries, rationing health and education by price and so on, even though such policies couldn't even be uttered in the countries from which they come and in which they live. So I don't want to see too much ideology in development policy. I want to see as much practical stuff as possible. Third concern is the disconnect I detect between what Professor Sen says, which I'm eager reader when I was doing my policy commission. I began by reading Freedom as Development, or Development as Freedom, sorry. Development as Freedom. I read it back to front. Like one does a thriller. He's always immensely pragmatic, very modulated and balanced, certainly not hostile to the free market. I often quote him as saying, to be generically against markets would be almost as odd as being generically against conversations between people, even though some conversations are clearly foul and cause problems for others, or even for the conversationalists themselves. So market operations are a normal part of human activity, and it's sad that some people, declaring themselves to be disciples of Amartya Sen, don't move in that direction. He quotes Adam Smith far more frequently than he does Karl Marx, and he usually quotes Karl Marx on the benefits of free markets rather than the reverse. So I get worried that sometimes the concepts which he has brought before us are misused and abused by those who want to justify micromanagement in developing countries. My fourth concern is that attempts at micromanagement are doomed to failure, I suspect. It's hard enough to macromanage an economy. It's hard enough to influence the rate of growth of an economy. We've put $2 trillion of aid into the world since the Second World War, and the beneficial effect in terms of growth has been far smaller than such a huge sum ought to have achieved. The idea that we can simultaneously micromanage the composition of growth to match a complex weighted average of a matrix of capabilities does seem to me extremely optimistic. My fifth concern is that an abstract approach to development often slides into justifying the liberal imperialist approach that enlightened intellectuals in this country have always taken, and particularly in Oxbridge, that they know best how the benighted natives of these countries we want to help should run their affairs, and they're going to tell them how to do it. And my biggest worry is that that distracts us as a country, and us as having influence in developed countries, from one of the most important things we can do, which is to offer opportunities to poor countries to trade out of poverty. And now I'm back on message again, because that was the view which brought Ming and Claire and Michael and John Battle and me together. Because most countries that have been successful in developing have done so through participating in world trade. It's harder for the poorest remaining countries to follow in their footsteps, because the early starters, the Chinas and so on, had the advantage of at least cheap labor through which they could break into the markets where labor was very expensive. The poorest countries following their wake now have to compete with those still cheap labor countries who have now in the meantime built up a critical mass of industrial capacity. So it behoves us as the developed world to open our markets preferentially to the poorest countries with no tariffs, no quotas, free access. We do that to some already in theory. We don't in practice, because we then impose rules like rules of origin and phytosanitary rules and so on, which mean that even where they theoretically have free access to our markets, they don't. So we're advocating liberalizing those rules, making them more generous, simplifying them, or removing them entirely. I've got a range of other non-negotiable demands that we'd like to see, but since I've reached the end of my time, I'd just say that we mustn't allow our ideological obsessions to blind us to the practical things we can do to give opportunities to developing countries.
Very good. Marcel Fafchamps, you're next.
My clearest recollection of Professor Sen's influence on me was when he presented a lecture at Stanford, where he put forth the idea of freedom and choice and agency as central to development. And I must say that I have since then, continued to reflect on that and in my work as a development economist, and I was trying to make sense of it within a framework that I know very well, which is the utility framework. The beauty of the utility framework is that it basically recognizes people's agency. It just recognizes their right to have preferences over bundles of goods, and it judges policy according to whether it satisfies these preferences. It's a kind of very satisfying ethical and philosophical principle where basically you base policy not on the views of the politicians or the views of the ruler, but rather on what people actually need and want. And it is true that this framework, the way it's being used too often is basically focusing only on income, and that is clearly a shortcoming because people care also about a lot of things they consume or benefit from that is not privately purchased. In many countries, healthcare like this one is largely, you don't pay for a lot of the services you get, even though you certainly value them. There are also lots of things that you benefit from through regulation that are not paid for, and so clearly if we want to have a better view, kind of a complete view of welfare well-being, we have to include all the things that you benefit from and you value, even though you might not purchase them through the market. So I think that's fairly clear, and the framework that we have could, in principle, be augmented to include all these public goods using contingent valuation or perhaps experimental evidence or revealed preferences to judge whether people, to what extent people value the kind of public goods we're talking about. Sorry. Now, and I think that this is important because some of the alternatives like HDLI and things like that, which use ad hoc weights and
what is HDL?
the Human Development Index, Development and Life Index, something like that. And these indices don't recognize the fact that countries at different levels of development might have very different preferences with respect to certain types of public goods. For instance, the richer people get, it looks to me, the richer they get, the more they care about very tiny, very small risks, especially health risks. They worry a lot about getting something from pesticides, which, or from GM foods, or from hormones in livestock production, or and so on. So they worry a lot about risks that are relatively small. And if you go to a lot of poor countries, developing countries, this is not something that rates very high on the agenda of most people because they have a lot of very real risk on an everyday basis, and these very distant risks actually don't seem to worry that much. Certainly, judging by the kind of way they drive on the road, for instance. Now, there are problems with putting utility, and which is basically a way of recognizing people's agency and preferences centerfold, because, of course, people's preferences can be manipulated to some extent, and there's always a temptation among development agencies, and I started my life in development agencies. There's always a temptation to say, well, we kind of know what people should need and should want. Why don't we convince them that that's what they need? And so basically, you go about and you proselytize whatever your worldview can be. And I've also seen over time, this was used to be done by development agencies themselves. Now they have kind of backed away a lot from that. But then now, of course, NGOs are very active, and a lot of them do exactly that. So it's something that worries me, and something that I was very pleased to find a lot of solace from Professor Sen's work and his emphasis on agency. And I thought that was very helpful. Now, there is a new literature, or something at least, that is hitting economists, which is a literature on subjective well-being. And what this literature, basically literature based on empirical observations of how people answer questions about subjective satisfaction with life, happiness, and so on. And what comes out of this literature are things like the fact that people seem to judge their subjective well-being based on their achievements relative to others and relative to a reference point. And so the fact that this reference point might move over time means that, GDP can double, their income can double, and they may not necessarily feel that much happier. Now, and similarly, they also might judge their achievements based on what others have been able to accomplish in their peer group, whatever they recognize as their peer group, and that generates, if you want, feelings of envy or feelings of, I don't know, pride or contempt, I don't know, depending on which side you are relative to the average. And this seems to be, these features seem to influence how happy and satisfied people seem to be with their life. And of course, it's very difficult to try to integrate these considerations in policy making. I have no solution to that, but I've observed that some people have used these arguments to try to say there's no need to do development assistance. I certainly don't agree with that. And there have got other people who have tried to use these arguments to say we should do redistribution, something I'm more sympathetic to, but I still don't know whether the subjective foundation should be the one we should use. Going back to choice, utility framework can capture a lot of dimensions of choice, but not all of them, because the process by which a decision is reached seems to be also something people value. If you have a child, a 4-year-old child, and you know he always eats chocolate ice cream, it's not a good idea just to order chocolate ice cream. What you're supposed to do is to say, what kind of ice cream would you like today? And he's going to, chocolate. Okay, so you get a chocolate ice cream. So the process matters. Even though you know he's going to eat a chocolate ice cream, it's a good idea to ask him what he would like to do. And this is true, of course, also of adults. So the process does matter, and the utility framework does not take that into account. And it's something that I think I really, really would like to have a way of integrating in the utility framework, some formal way of making that part of the framework. Now, people also make mistakes. So there are lots of government interventions that are based on the idea that people might have don't have well-defined preferences, so if they have well-defined preferences, they don't always follow them in the choices they make. And for instance, we ban heroin, we ban cannabis, we ban tobacco from many places, we oblige people to drive with a safety belt, and or we might also ban people from jumping off cliffs in Devon. So these are things that we do to protect them from their mistakes, but the question is how far can you go to protect them from their mistakes? I don't have an easy answer to that, but I think it's something that is clearly important if you think about welfare as based on choice. Another simple observation, people seem to like to impose some constraints on themselves. Think of diet, for instance, or dietary restrictions. A lot of people have dietary restrictions. They used to be based on religion, and still are for quite a few people. But now that, for many of us, there are no more religious dietary restrictions, people seem to reinvent them. They reinvent themselves vegetarian or vegetarian plus fish, or they don't eat milk, or they don't they just come up with some, usually, and this can also change. It's a la carte, they can change. So I think if you're going to think in terms of value of choice, and people actually like to self-constrain themselves, it's something that I find very puzzling, but something I would like to have some guidance on. Finally, before I conclude, this is also casual empiricism perhaps, but just like people are rival in their subjective well-being, they derive some satisfaction from doing well and doing well relative to others. It's also my impression that they actually derive some satisfaction from having more choice than others, and possibly also from restricting other people's choices. So they might, I remember, building code in Britain allows gives a lot of freedom to neighbors to have a say on what you can do or cannot do. My neighbor complained on the we're building something next to my house, and the other neighbor complained that in the building plan there was a tree, and the tree was planned to be a walnut tree, and there were too many walnut trees in the area, and therefore she objected to the fact that they were not going to plant a walnut tree. Like, well, I'm sorry, but it's not your business really what kind of tree they plant. So I think that, so if that is true that people like to restrict other people's choices, and we have a democracy, then over time there's going to be more regulation to restrict people's choices, because that's what people like to do. And so this is something I worry about, this kind of rampant increase in regulation, of course always justified through some kind of externality, but how far do we go? And just, I guess, just a very obvious observation, there are lots of developing countries where you actually have, of course you might not have a lot of political freedom, but you're going to have a lot of everyday freedom. You can drive anywhere you want, you can drive any car you want, any vehicle you want, you can smoke anywhere you want, you can spit anywhere you want. There are lots of things you'll be able to do that you couldn't do in a developed economy, and so I think that that might actually be a symptom of that. So to conclude, there are some really interesting but also difficult ethical and philosophical issues raised by welfare analysis. The utility framework deals with many of them in a consistent way. It recognizes individual agency, and so doing it encourages policies that aim to increase welfare by increasing material well-being in a way that matches people's preferences, and I think that's very valuable, something I don't want to lose. It also encourages policies that increase choice by increasing income. Income is basically choice, that's what it is. It's as I learned from Professor Sen. I think it should be, whatever framework we have should include the utility derived from public goods. But as an approach, I think it's more ethically satisfying than many alternatives. For instance, using propaganda to manipulate people's preferences through awareness campaign or education campaign or various campaigns, or by restricting their choice to what is good for them, like Salvation Army style. So basically you say, oh, well, you shouldn't drink, you shouldn't smoke, you shouldn't do this. We're going to do what is good for you. It's a kind of paternalistic view of development, which I also object to. So I really thank Professor Sens for putting freedom and choice back very squarely at the center of the agenda. And it's still revolutionary today. It always will be, basically. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. And you'll detect a slight, perhaps, shift in perspective. But first, I want to say thank you very much for inviting me to participate today. And it's a real privilege to sit here on the same panel, obviously with Professor Sen, but also such important thinkers from within the political realm and the realm of economic research. Marcel, as you were speaking, I had a slight sense that I might be sitting next to Rational Economic Man, and I thought you might be it. And I thought, well, how does that go down in the messy world of politics and policy, which is something I'm going to try and reflect on a little bit. With all due respect to those of you who inhabit this world much more than I do, but this is very much from a perspective of where I work in ODI. We are a policy think tank. We very much locate our work at the interface between research, evidence, and policy making in support of international development and humanitarian issues. And as part of doing that, we spend a fair amount of time thinking about how ideas generated out of high-quality research make it into, or don't make it into, the policy-making process. And I'm going to make a few reflections about that as a way of perhaps rounding off this panel. Let me just start, though, with one of the backdrop issues for this set of panels today, which has been the financial crisis. And at the beginning of the financial crisis, there was quite a lot of talk, including within the international development world, about this being a game changer for how we think about development. This is a crisis of capitalism. This is going to fundamentally shift the calculus around which we've thought about growth and development in particularly low-income countries for the future. And there was, in the blog sphere, it was full of talk of definancialization, of de-linkage, alternative models of growth, and the need to move beyond the metrics of monetary welfare. And to talk of new concepts for dealing with systemic shocks and for dealing with the notion of resilience, which is a concept that has entered into the lexicon of development thinkers, I think, over the last number of months. Here we are, 12 months, 18 months on, if you like, and we're no longer staring into the abyss of the financial crisis, and talk of game changing seems to have disappeared somewhat. We doubt perhaps that the crisis has actually created an opportunity for a big rethink, particularly in international development. I don't think there's any doubt that it has posed opportunities to question some fundamental things, but I think the energy and enthusiasm for coming up with alternative models seems to have waned somewhat. And perhaps we doubted in the first place whether or not we needed a game changer. Interesting to reflect. And you'll have heard of a number of viewpoints in the panels today that perhaps explain why this enthusiasm for thinking through alternatives has perhaps waned somewhat. One possible reason is, in fact, the response to the crisis in the end is more about politics than it is ever going to be about economics. What I want to do in the next few minutes, though, is to also pose a very modest contribution to why it may be the case that the crisis and the opportunity that, indeed, as James Pannell indicated, has been created by it for a bit of a rethink may not have been taken up perhaps as vigorously as we'd like. And I'm going to suggest that has something to do with the way in which research and ideas get their way into policy thinking. As I said, ODI works at the interface of this spectrum in what we might call the Twilight Zone, or based on Sabina's comments earlier, it might be called the fluffy zone of applied research and practice. One thing we do know is that a lot of research, including in the field of economics, is generated relatively slowly. I say relatively, some, within matters of months, but some within matters of years, under relatively ideal conditions, and I'm thinking here of a lot of the modelling work that gets done within economics, with major worries on behalf of researchers about potential instrumentalization of research for policy purposes, and they deliberately stay away, therefore, from posing particular policy questions, but would rather drive their research from first theoretical principles. And as Sabina also noted in her introduction, that research tends to be, and I would say economics is probably more guilty here, it's very fractious, and one in which vested interests tend to play themselves out in more or less useful ways. And I'm just going to quote you something from a book which you may have come across by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, called The Spirit Level, Why Some Societies Are More Equal Than Others, which states that discoveries are more rapidly accepted in the natural sciences. Physical theories are somehow less controversial than theories about the social world, maybe because social theories are partly theories about ourselves, and as such attract a plethora of individual views and powerful vested interests. And I would say that probably sums up a good deal of the fractiousness that one observes, particularly, I think, within thinking on development economics. Research, policy. Policy, on the other hand, the whole policy world is often shaped under less than ideal conditions. It needs to move fast, sometimes too fast, as I'm sure James and Peter will recognize. It's also shaped by the values, the habits, the norms of policymakers themselves, and by the type of political actors that they surround themselves with, often much more than the quality or the quantity of evidence in front of them. And in fact, there's a phrase that we use frequently in ODI, which is that much of the work that we do is about trying to build evidence-based policy making, where in fact we're dealing with a world in which there is policy-based evidence making, in which actually the process is in reverse. And in fact, I think it was a book back in the 1980s by Ed Clay and others who said, and I quote, that policy the whole life of policy is a chaos of purposes and accidents. And I suspect that may be one reason why good ideas, however well researched, don't necessarily always make it into policy making, and why there's also quite a lot of scope for kind of lazy thinking and fluffy thinking making its way into policy making that ends up with all kinds of policy failures. Even when there are high-quality ideas, therefore, coming out of the strong disciplines such as economics, there are no guarantees, and I think within development thinking this is perhaps more so than in other fields, that those ideas will be taken up. And in fact, the development landscape, and I completely endorse what Peter said, is filled with policy experiments that have been based very inadequately on evidence. But why is this the case? Well, one of the reasons, I think, within economics is that the whole field of sort of policy-relevant research design seems to be continually dismissed as imprecise, as fluffy, as lacking in sufficient theory, and I think that's a real shame, and I think we have to strive much more to come up with research designs guiding economic thinking which are policy relevant and, dare I even say it, solutions focused. Much research in economics simply does not address the fundamental question of how many lives will be affected by a policy change, and I think Sabina said something like this at the beginning. And also, it doesn't often give us the answers about the limits of policy, which again would be as important as knowing the scope for policy change to contribute to a better society. Of course, we're all as well faced with the harsh reality that ideas within the research community, but also within the policy community, are increasingly sourced from a global space, from networks, from discipline, from outside of single disciplines. And I think this tends to raise a challenge to all of us about how we hold on to the integrity of disciplinary perspectives while recognizing that there has been a rapid democratization of ideas and policy making within the global space over the last 20 years or so. But it also reminds us that any one professional group, or organization for that matter, in thinking about development, that claims a monopoly of ideas is, to my mind, in an untenable situation. So the kinds of challenge posed by Professor Sen's latest book, but also his accumulated works, points to the need for a greater plurality, excuse me, this is a word I find hard to say, plurality of approach to work across intellectual boundaries and geographic boundaries on a set of real-world policy problems that rarely know any boundaries. And I think this is our ultimate challenge, to bring the relationship between research and policy that much more closer. Nairi mentioned that somebody might say something about the MDGs in this panel, so I feel obliged to say something just to finish off. The Millennium Development Goals framework have played an incredibly important role as a kind of political manifesto, I think, for change globally. But they were, as Professor Sen outlined, conceived within a context in which notions of rights, accountability, and actually I would even say fairness and justice were firmly part of the thinking. And the goals themselves came out of a technical process which has somehow lost touch with those very important ideas. But actually their achievement is fundamentally about our ability to address issues, in my view, around fairness and equity. So we've got to a situation where I think within development research and to some extent within development economics, we've become completely obsessed with the measurable and the observable as it's expressed through the goals, and completely unable to relate to the fundamental principles on which they're trying to deliver around a just society and a just world. So there are a number of policy areas which are completely missing from our lexicon or dominant thinking in development at the moment, around the role, for example, of anti-discrimination as being fundamental to achieve some of the goals around gender equality, maternal mortality, and so on. Around progressive taxation, something economists should be busily working around all the time, is how can we build a more progressive taxation structure that delivers the kind of equitable results for poor people. And beginning to operationalize notions around things like social minima and the rest. Where is our intellectual effort in relation to those kinds of things that are going to be fundamental for delivering the MDGs? So finally, I wouldn't agree entirely with Peter. I believe strongly that theory has a very important role to play. There's that phrase, nothing as practical as a really good theory. I believe that profoundly. But it is the ability to combine theoretical and empirical work, to understand how policy processes work in order to be able to communicate effectively, to not shy away from pluralism and pragmatism, and not to shy away from being very clear about the contribution of economic research to thinking about the kind of society that we want to be living in.
Well, we've had an enormously rich range of ideas in the last half hour. What I suppose has bound them together is the difficulty of making good policy, the dangers that policy is hijacked by ideologues on the one hand or micromanagers on the other hand, the complexity of increasing people's welfare and of providing the choice that people want without diminishing the choice of some at the expense of increasing the welfare of others. And the difficulty of prioritizing, of using evidence effectively, of trying to trying to focus on what policy really achieves. I want to hear a little bit from Professor Sen, but we have to get him out of here in about 10 minutes' time. And I'm worried that that doesn't really allow much time for all of you to ask questions. So I'm afraid what I'm going to do is hijack the whole procedure and do one of these awful journalistic things of asking all three panelists to give me their top practical way in which we, at this very interesting moment in time, both globally, in the aftermath of the financial crisis, and nationally with an election just a few months off, what is the one thing that they would like to see change, that if they had limitless powers, they would change in either practical ways or in research ways, to move a little closer to the world of Professor Sen's ideas. And then if you are all brief in your replies, and it's such an impossible question, you'll have to be brief, I'll then get Professor Sen just to wind up with a soundbite at the end. This is the Today programme in the afternoon. So who am I going to pick on first? I think I will go in the same order that I did before. I think I will start off with you, Peter Lilley, or your
Well, I gave my policy proposal first of all. So shall I make a theoretical observation which entirely ignores your question? And that is, on an earlier part of the discussion, there was a presumption that those who believe in the free market, whether as a conversation or as a natural part of human life and desirable part of the development process, have no ethical basis or spurn ethics, or that the free market idea is sort of antithetical to an ethical basis. Professor Sen doesn't say that. He made quite clear, and he quotes the great economists like Adam Smith as integrating their ethical basis. All the free market, defenders of the free market say, is not that people have no ethical dimension, that they're purely selfish. Ordinary people pursue their self-interest and pursue altruistic interests. What we have to do is make sure that those selfish interests are harnessed to the common good, and that's what the free market does.
good.
If you put the selfish interests in control of the state, there's no guarantee that they will be of benefit to society.
Very good. Oh, Marcel.
Okay. Well, if I had infinite power, I'd probably just relinquish it right away. I mean, this is a temptation you have when you work in development for long enough, especially when you're young, I guess. It's a temptation that, you arrive in a country and it's all messed up and you think, I could do better than that. And I've learned that that is not true, in most of the time. I mean, just basically, so yes, I would say more choice, more recognition of people's agency, and taking...
I think
I've turned it on. And basically taking people, whether they're poor or rich, seriously. Yeah.
Good. That's a very good line. Alison.
Okay, we need to make sure that economics is a spur to action, not a block to action, and an appeal for more collective action.
Elegantly. You see, the panel has become pithier and pithier as I've worked my way around. Now, the challenge is yours, Professor Sen, to wind up in a few sentences.
Well, my challenge is made somewhat easier by Francis. You're telling me that my expulsion from the room is much more important than my speech. But I enjoyed the discussion very much. I'm going to react a little against your question, because it's a kind of question I'm kind of, Peter might think it's ideology. I'm opposed to, namely, what is one thing to do, okay? That's a very good question when there's only one thing you can do. Okay, now, yeah. But if you can do only one thing but not others, then that's a good question to pursue. But we typically can do lots of things, you see. And when I land in Bombay and somebody says, what are the 3 things you would like to do in India, and is it child poverty, is it undernourishment, is it illiteracy? I have to say, no, I have at least 125 things to do. So I'm not sure I'm going to fall for that. But I see where you're coming from, namely focus. And I think that's important, and it allows me to hit my comment on one of the questions that came up. That is the question of plurality. I think it came up in...
I'm just going to move your microphone. Right?
See, I'm not succeeding, am I?
If I put it here.
I see. Yeah. I guess I was trying to look at the panelists, and this is compatible with looking at the panelists. I think the plurality issue is extremely important, because there are going to be a number of things that come up that demand our attention, and we have to judge between them. The first point is to recognize that there exists a plurality which is very central, and it's only ideology would make you say that only forget all the others, just this one counts. But then there's a second thing, that in that context you also have to, after recognizing the plurality, ask the question of evaluation, namely, how do you weight them? Face all that explicitly, and that's why in the context of James's discussion, I was saying that I would emphasize not the state, but the public discussion on it as a supplement to the market. Market as a system competes with another way of deciding, which is public discussion. That comes up as the capability literature too. Some of our colleagues have tried to argue for a kind of special list of things that arrive not on the basis of public discussion, but on the basis of intelligent reflection, like Aristotle did, and arrived at something, which I would tend to reject on grounds that I think public discussion is central. And the question of weighting is very important. I remember when more than 20 years ago, before the Berlin Wall came out, chatting, I went a couple of times to East Germany before that, and trying to argue whether in the perspective of freedom, which, by the way, I think would convince you that I'm a renegade, is very important in Marx. That no one discusses freedom as much as he did, including in his PhD thesis, Marx's PhD thesis. Contrary to popular belief, he did write a PhD thesis on Democritus and Epicurus, and he took Aristotelian side on that, and freedom played a very big part in that. So when we were discussing, I was told, but there are many freedoms that you have in East Germany which you don't have in West. And I was given one example, which is absolutely right. That is, you could turn right when the traffic light is red and you are facing it, as you can in Boston, but you can't in New York. And there, again, as Bostonians, I always feel pity for New Yorkers, waiting for the traffic light to change when there's nothing on the other side. You can turn easily, and it doesn't allow. East Germany allowed that freedom. West Germany did not. But you'll require a fair amount of effort to place it in a greater importance to whether you have the freedom to climb a wall or not, which was the manifest issue there. So I think the issue of plurality, which is going to come up, I think there have been interesting discussion about not being ideological, taking approaches that take into account variety of consideration. And I think in all of them, if we, and it also relates to the question that there are going to be many things, not one thing we are going to do. And there would be what relative importance we attach to them. That's really not so much what is the one thing I end up saying is most important, and I think I probably won't say any of them to be most important than others under all conditions, but what are the alternative things that we have to consider? Not alternative, they're complementary things to consider, and how do we go about it? That is not a kind of Tory, Labour, right-left distinction. That's a very basic distinction. And I think if I may just end up with one practical comment, I think one of the reasons, this came up earlier in the discussion as to why the huge opportunity that the crisis looked like, namely to have a game changer, didn't quite happen. I think part of it is that it was not a sufficiently critically engaged discussion as to what was involved. I think for one thing, since people were so lined up in neoclassical versus Keynesian, this was seen just as a huge vindication of Keynes. But as I tried to argue in an article in the New York Review of Books, for which I paid a heavy price in the form of attack, is that Keynes had less to say on social support and social security than Bismarck had. Is almost nothing to say on that. And in fact, a neoclassical opponent, namely Pigou, who might have had a wrong theory of unemployment, was constantly boring everyone, was talking about the role of poverty. He was the one who, Atkinson's measure of poverty is in fact a variation of Pigou's measure via Dalton that came to be accepted. So I think there was the kind of question that a lot of people were raising at that time, including Tony and others from the left, who, what is the role of democracy? Can America go to a health reform more easily if people come to dominate the public space in the way they have by death camps and so on? Why is it that the Tory and Labour can agree on the importance of national health service, whereas you find it very difficult to find a single conservative in America saying anything good to say about healthcare? I think it raises a question about the nature of the society. And it's really not the Keynes territory at all. I think it's a completely different territory. And I think if we had got to that territory there, we would have got more out of the crisis than we actually did. Thank you.